You can't always tell what people mean when they talk about inclusion. Sometimes it gets mixed up with belonging and it can get really confusing, but I'm going to help you to make sense of it all. I'm Dr. Jonathan. I work with organizations to make them inclusive, and I'm on a mission to help 1 million people like you to make your workplace inclusive. Get your pen and paper ready because we're talking about 3 types of inclusion that you need to understand if you want to see change in your workplace. This is the first of a 2-part series about the meaning of inclusion. We need to talk about this because I've said it before and I'll say it again. Diversity and inclusion are 2 of the most used and abused words in the workplace today. Lots of people talk about them in ways that aren't helpful, aren't precise, and therefore aren't useful for you. As a regular listener, you already know that we did a show called 3 Types of Diversity You Need to Understand to Create Inclusion. If you haven't listened to that episode, make sure you do. It's all about diversity. This episode is all about inclusion. Here, we describe inclusion as a systematic business strategy to ensure that everyone shares the same advantages and benefits. Everyone can perform, everyone can belong, everyone can reach their potential. Inclusion means everyone, not just so-called minority groups. But let's get more specific. When we work with our clients, I like to draw attention to 3 types of inclusion. Are these the only types of inclusion that exist in the world? Of course not, but I'm sharing them with you because it's useful, especially because there's not enough quality research on this topic. The first type of inclusion that you need to understand is work group inclusion. Work group inclusion is focused on the experience of the individual within the group. You've probably been part of a team, a department, or a group that needed to cooperate to achieve a particular goal, as a one-off or as a regular feature of your work. Once upon a time, I was an accountant. I used to be an auditor. I worked in a team. I led a team. Work group inclusion would refer to the experiences of the individuals within my team, the extent to which they felt included in the work group. Sounds straightforward, but in practice it's not easy because the research argues that the challenge is finding a balance between maintaining a unique identity and the need to find a sense of similarity and a sense of belonging with others in the work group. This is the challenge with all types of inclusion. You also notice that I'm very clearly distinguishing between belonging and inclusion. Some people think it's a completely different thing. My experience and what the research says is that belonging and uniqueness are both key elements of inclusion, pardon the pun, especially in work groups. Work group inclusion is associated with positive outcomes like job satisfaction, organizational commitment, job performance, well-being. There's a long list. You hear people throwing out random bits of research all the time, but it's not always put into context. I'm telling you this because I want to protect you from making the same mistakes that others are making. The second type of inclusion you need to understand is leader inclusion. Leadership is something that gets discussed so often, it's not hard to see why. One lesson of 2020 that I don't expect anyone to argue with is that we would all benefit if we had more effective leaders in the world. There are so many models of leadership out there, but it's worth noting that like work group inclusion, the inclusive abilities of the leader are often described from the perspective of the individual and not the leader. So when we talk about leader inclusion, it's nearly always from the perspective of those being led. Going back to my audit team, the extent to which I was considered to be an inclusive leader by the members of my team is something that is of concern to my team, but it should also be of concern to me. The research suggests that inclusive leaders are important for facilitating team performance. Inclusive leaders enhance identification with the team, which in turn improves team performance. Inclusive leaders lower the perception of status differences, which allows for improved team performance. This word performance keeps coming up and it's relevant. Why? Because it's one of the 3 biggest problems that organizations experience on their inclusion journey, and that's performance. Organizations struggle to articulate a business case for diversity for their specific organization. They're bought into a generic business case, but when it comes to inclusion, they're not always able to say why it works. An inclusive leader should be able to answer that question. The third and final type of inclusion that you need to understand is organizational inclusion. Perceived organizational inclusion refers to individual level perceptions of an employee's inclusion in the organization. This tends to be what people mean when they use the term inclusion generically, the extent to which a person feels included in the organization. This covers a whole host of issues, from work groups to culture to decision making, access to information, access to resources, all the stuff you hear people talk about. Once again, there are a lot of studies that discuss why this is important, and if you're on LinkedIn, people are telling you this all the time, but without context. The point I'm trying to make here is that when we discuss these things, it's useful to be more intentional about what we mean and why. When you talk about inclusion, what do you mean? Work group inclusion? Leader inclusion? Organizational inclusion? Maybe it's all of them. That said, which of these are you working on today? All of them? What are you doing specifically to address workgroup inclusion, and how does it differ from what you're doing to address organizational inclusion? Now we start to get more interesting answers. This is a big topic, and I just wanted to introduce you to it so that you could be more intentional about what you mean and why. So let's wrap this up. What are the key messages here? There are 3 types of inclusion that you need to understand. 1. Workgroup inclusion. This is concerned with individual teams and groups. 2. Leader inclusion. This is concerned with leaders. And 3. Organizational inclusion. This is concerned with the entire organization. So what do you think? Which of these types of inclusion is getting the most attention where you work? Get in touch or leave a message. I would love to hear from you. If you've learned something from today's show, then give us a review on iTunes. It helps other people like you to find the show. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.